you like werewolves? How about vampires? Then you are a heretic, sir, and an affront to the natural order. What are you, some kind of twitard? Is that still even what they call you guys? I thought all the Twilight fans went extinct with Tumblr. Well, I guess there's only one thing to be done. Come here. I just want to talk. I just want to talk. The Order 1886 is a game about vampires and werewolves, sort of, kind of, and more importantly, it's an example of a Sony exclusive that was largely a miss. One could say the critics really took an axe to it. Reviewers scored first and axed questions later. I'm sure that when the developers saw the scores, they were in excruciating pain. Okay, I'm sorry. Look, I won't do any more. I felt like I needed to justify this whole bit, so you're gonna have to bear with me a little bit. It won't happen again. That was a lie. Almost 8 years after its launch, The Order remains a game forgotten by most people, most of which looked at the relatively short runtime, which wasn't even as short as people were saying it was, honestly, and the fact that it didn't have the tight, refined gameplay of a hybrid love child of Doom Eternal and Dark Souls. And yes, I will continue to make references to both of these games anytime I'm discussing gameplay in a flattering way, and you can't stop me. Still, in spite of its detractors, The Order is regarded by a passionate few to be a game well ahead of its time. A game with a great many redeeming qualities that, despite its imperfections, does not deserve the ire that has been largely received. In The Order, we play as Sir Galahad, a veteran knight of the Order, a secret waspy society of defenders founded by the Knights of the Round of Arthurian legend, sworn to hold off the forces of darkness, or some such. Think of the CIA, except they fight werewolves instead of destabilizing third world countries. The events of the game carry Galahad and by proxy us through London as he fights alongside his fellow knights against violent insurgents fighting against the Order and the Crown. Now I know what you're thinking, defending the Crown against insurgents and other rebel groups? This reeks of colonial oppression and all that jazz. But as far as I can recall, Galahad shoots almost exclusively white dudes, and that's fine, who cares about those guys? Eventually, Galahad finds himself tangled up in conspiracies, loss, betrayal, and personal redemption at the cost of everything he believes in as he struggles to maintain his honor while pursuing justice and what he believes is right. Galahad is a bit of a stoic character for the most part, a typically gruff and brooding sort of fellow with the most iconically masculine mustache I've seen in gaming since Mario himself. Just look at it, it's magnificent. You know how many cookies he could dust with that thing? Galahad is grizzled and battle-worn, but he has a strong sense of duty, honor, and loyalty to his friends and the knights he has served beside for countless years. By the time the credits rolled on The Order, I felt deeply conflicted about my time with the game and where I stood with the wildly fluctuating quality of its various elements. I was stuck in the middle of two opposing factions, the group that thought that the game was compelling and the group that thought that it was trash. I felt like Sir Galahad himself, who was torn between the time-honored traditions of everything he knew and the lure of finding the truth conveniently nestled in the bosom of a beautiful Indian rebel queen. Only instead of any of that, I was stuck between one group of gamers that were outraged because the game wasn't all the things that they expected it to be, and another group of gamers that thought that it was the greatest game ever, had absolutely no problems at all, and was the best thing that ever came around since tea and crumpets. Some might say I'm leaning too hard into the British humor, except everybody hates the British, including the British, so it's fine. Through all the conflicting ideas and emotions that I had during my playthrough of The Order, one question remained with me throughout. Honestly, did The Order even deserve all the hate? Be ye warned. Spoilers ahead, guys. I'm going to be discussing all kinds of elements and details about The Order, including the story, setting, lore, and visual elements of the game that are probably best experienced for the first time by you when you play it, as is the case with most games. I don't know why I even have to tell you guys this. Y'all should know how it goes. Why are you a bunch of babies crying about spoiler warnings, guys? Why? You're adults-ish. Probably not. You're probably still a kid. What do I know? The point is, we're going to get into it, but I'm not going to do any deep dive spoilers until well into the end of the video. I will give a time on screen so that you can avoid getting the absolute biggest spoilers, which will mostly consist of a discussion about the ending of the game because it's pretty relevant to my experience. Before that point, there will be visual spoilers. I will talk a little bit about plot and general setups for the world and whatnot, but I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty. I'm not going to get into deep dive territory of details. So if you watch up until the spoiler warning, you'll probably be okay, unless you just want a totally blind experience, in which case, why are you here? I steered clear of the Order for nearly 8 years. I took a peek at it on launch, saw some pretty low to middling reviews, and saw some scathing words from various sources regarding its short length and divisive quality, and decided there was too much heat coming off that particular dumpster fire to feel comfortable dumping my limited funds into it. Almost a decade has passed, and now I'm somehow even more attractive than I was then. Let me have this. And having at last played The Order in the year of our Lord 2022, I can understand the controversy. The game is far from flawless. The Order has blemishes and rough patches. It has weaknesses and shortcomings. How much these shortcomings and weaknesses detract from your experience and enjoyment with The Order is really down to personal taste and what is important to you in a game. Some people will find the ways that The Order misses the mark to be glaring and unforgivable. Some people will find these issues negligible and easily overlooked if they even notice them at all. For my part, I find myself somewhere between the two extremes. When The Order is strong, it's Hulk smash kind of strong. Visual presentation, fidelity, art direction, and world design are all spectacular in The Order, to the point that I would even say Ready at Dawn, the developers of The Order, accomplished something nigh on groundbreaking at the time. The Order released about 8 years ago, and I challenge you to find a game released in 2015 as visually advanced and compelling as The Order on a technical level alone. I mean, look at this. These graphics are 8 years old, and they can honestly compete with a lot of current year games. It's insane how great this looks. And on top of that, The Order was a Sony exclusive released for the PlayStation 4, not even the PlayStation Pro, mind you. So The Order's graphics don't even benefit from running off of a high-end PC, which could boost its capabilities through the stratosphere. There's some interesting and very specific reasons The Order was able to pack so much visual detail, density, and bleeding-edge performance into this game beyond just the simple skills of Ready at Dawn, though the dev studio's skill and talent is plain to see. Luke Stevens explains this in depth in a far better way than I'm going to be able to in his video covering the game, so I suggest you give it a watch if you want a more thorough breakdown of how these visuals were possible, especially as far back as 8 years ago. I'll link his video in the description below. The strength of The Order's visual elements don't simply rest upon its technical power and fidelity alone. The art design of the game is a banger, bringing the alternate history Victoria-era London and its steampunk meets folklore fantasy elements to life with an attention to detail in its environments, architecture, and sheer density of small but meaningful touches that we barely see in gaming, and is reminiscent of some of the finest work coming out of much bigger studios such as Naughty Dog, Insomniac, or even Santa Monica Studios. We traverse the streets of London, common folk houses, stately manors, underground passageways, warehouses, the entirety of a well-furnished and sophisticated floating airship, and more. And when I say we traverse these environments, for the most part we, how should we say, blow them the fuck up. Galahad may have many chivalric virtues, but patience, subtleness, and discretion are not on the list. When you're able to actually see through the smoke and spray of bullets, the environments are densely detailed, packed with the sort of small touches that bring the world to life in believable ways, making the dingy, winding streets and richly appointed grand houses of London feel tangible and real. The Order's unique setting and world building serve to reinforce the narrative and lore that make up the central characters, politics, and conflicts, which is in itself intriguing and original. The Order follows a group of knights of Victorian-era London serving the titular order. Each knight takes the moniker of one of the original knights serving King Arthur in the court of Camelot. There are plentiful references to the Arthurian legend and mythos, but it isn't necessary to be familiar with the King Arthur story to be able to understand the events of the Order. Rather, any familiarity will enrich the experience, as you will be privy to the various nods and offhand references to the legendary figures of Arthurian legend, and this will deepen the understanding of all of the lore and background story that add depth to the Order's setting and circumstances. Without all this backstory and context, you're left with grumpy mustachioed Nightman kills vampires and werewolves. And that's already a better story than Twilight, so instant win. A big source of the controversy with the Order is the gameplay. It's been critiqued as cookie cutter and routine without much in the realm of innovations or deeper substance. The gameplay in the Order consists of exploring the environments, progressing the linear path forward toward the goals and unfolding events of the game. Since Sir Galahad is more nimble and sprightly than his stuffy attitude and luxurious mustache would suggest, you'll do a fair bit of jumping, climbing, swinging, and general parkour type navigation along the way between the action set pieces. The action of the game consists largely of cover-based shooting sections, some light stealth segments, and cinematically driven QuickTime button prompt events. The parkour and traversal sections of the game help break up the progression of traveling and navigating between fighting and story segments. These never really hit much of a wow factor or many crazy over-the-top moments, but they serve to keep the flow of the game moving along just fine. Being that the cover shooter part of the gameplay is probably the meatiest slice of the gameplay pie, it's pretty important to ask, is it any good? Honestly, this is going to come down to taste and tolerance. I can understand why some people don't enjoy this style of gameplay. It's a bit of a relic of its time, and game design has largely moved forward from this style of shooting toward approaches that are a bit more mobile and engaging. As someone who has played every Uncharted game and went through the best of the cover-based shooting genre, I don't mind this style of gameplay, but it tends to stale quickly, and almost any game that leans into cover mechanics in more than just a passing way typically feels like this loop has overstayed its welcome before the credits roll. The Order's short-ish game length and a reasonable amount of alternative gameplay systems generously sprinkled throughout save the Order from falling into this sense of monotonous, played-out loop. Although, let me tell you, it got right up there. Still, there are a decent variety of guns, shooting situations, and enemy types to keep the cover-based shooting changing up enough that it stays mostly to the good side of engaging. There are some especially interesting weaponry on offer that fits the steampunk aesthetics of the Order perfectly. Everything from combustible thermite launchers to remote detonating sticky grenade launchers, repeating crossbows, full-on shoulder-mounted artillery mortars, even rifles that fire great arcs of lightning that will instantly fry almost any target it hits. These are the standouts that really shine alongside the more standard single-shot marksman rifles, assault rifles, snipers, pistols, shotguns, and both smoke and frag grenades, all of which feel fitting for the setting we're playing in. Gunplay is smooth and handles well, and moving in and out of cover, vaulting over obstacles, and closing the distance for close-quartered weaponry like the shotgun all feel responsive and engaging, which is pretty important considering how much of the gameplay loop is centered in the shooting. Stealth is a thing in the Order, but it's applied lightly with fairly minimal focus and seems to be more for variety's sake than being a real option to be used regularly throughout the game. In most instances, you will be forced into combat or you will be forced into stealth rather than getting to choose which to use and where. Stealth results in some visually satisfying takedowns and kills, and the window for getting these kills to activate without being detected is generous to the point that stealthing isn't much of a challenge. Stealth fans may appreciate the nod to the quieter gameplay approach, but they certainly won't be challenged by the sneaky parts of the Order. Finally, we have the cinematic QuickTime events and button prompts. I'm of pretty mixed feelings on this part of the game. On the one hand, I find an over-reliance on QuickTime events and button prompts to disguise a lack of gameplay variety and engagement to be, and you can quote me on this, distasteful as fuck. And there have been a number of games that lean hard into this element. I've played enough Telltale games and David Cage games that at this point when I see a button prompt come up on screen, my fight or flight kicks in and I've got my controller half-cocked to launch it through the screen before I catch myself and rein it in. That said, as long as it doesn't become the central means of player interaction throughout the whole game, I don't mind some QuickTime events, especially when partnered with some really well-presented set pieces that play on a sense of urgency and intensity tied to the prompts and interactions. In this sense, the Order did fine. Many of these QTE segments are some of the most viscerally and intense that I can recall in recent memory and really push the ferocity of Galahad's struggle to the forefront. I mean, fuck, man. Look at that shit. And look at this shit. This is not what I would call a boring QuickTime event. You can say whatever you want about QuickTime events, but that's categorically not boring. Personally, I think it's unfair to criticize these moments too harshly considering the prevalence of QTEs in many other major release games that never got any kind of flack or grief for any of it. QuickTime events appear in some form or another in almost all action-adventure games these days, and as long as it doesn't take up the center stage, it almost always enriches the game rather than takes away from it, giving a cinematic flair and tension to otherwise over-the-top boss encounters in ways that honestly you can't program for normal minimal gameplay functions. We have games that we herald as absolute classics, such as God of War, the old ones and the new ones, the Uncharted series, The Last of Us, for fuck's sake. There's so many games that use QTEs but use them sparingly and wisely, and I feel like the Order fits into that category just fine. More than gameplay itself, one of my biggest complaints is with the choice of who and what Galahad is typically beefing with. Let me reiterate for those of you with short attention spans that have already forgotten. There are lycans and vampires in this game. We are a steampunk knight tasked with defending the realms from the forces of darkness. We're taking on huge animalistic werewolves and elegant, chillingly powerful vampire lord, and that is awesome. Except you hardly fight any werewolves, and you don't even fight a vampire at all. The majority of this game centers around fighting wave after wave of human gunmen, and I mean, what the hell, man? I get that it's far easier to mass produce a bunch of encounters with regular old human gunmen than it is to specially design a bunch of encounters with werewolves and vampires and all the crazy supernatural shit that goes into that. It's probably easier both in terms of designing gameplay as well as time spent on design and imaging, drawing, and all that, like all that shit. I get it. But really, you mean to tell me that at some point, Ready at Dawn sat down at the table together to plan all of this out and they said, all right, let's take a vote. What's gonna make this section of the game totally badass? Humans or werewolves? And you're gonna tell me right in front of my miniature Ranny that even one person raised their hands and was like, humans, yay, bullshit. Petty, if justified grievances with the lack of werewolf combat aside, it's hard to deny the quality of the Order's narrative beats. The level of visual quality along with solid writing and strong voice acting performances speak for themselves. Whether it's an action sequence, the unfolding story of conspiracies, werewolves, and vampires, or the character building interactions and interpersonal dramas of the Knights of the Order, it's all a feast for the eyes and an intriguing exploration of an original alternate history world and the characters in it. I've seen a fair bit of complaints about the narrative, mostly about the cutscene driven segments of the game due to their frequency and length. I get that. There was more than one time I found myself thinking that some of the cutscenes and walking sections were getting long in the tooth, especially in context of the modest overall runtime of the game. While I occasionally felt some impatience to get the fancy guns back in my hands, characters and plot developments remained interesting and gave plenty of insight into the lore and backstory of the Order's detailed world. Some of these scenes could have done with a trim, but I can't fault them for quality. Finally, the game's length itself is quite the contentious issue, with many people feeling the game was simply too short. I'm of the general opinion that a game doesn't need to be long for it to be a good experience. As a matter of fact, I could think of quite a few games that have suffered from unnecessary bloat and too much fluff content. Sometimes less is more, and in the Order's case, I think it benefits from a more concentrated and self-contained experience. But I also played the Order years after release and paid next to nothing for it, and it's possible that if I had paid a full 60 buckaroos for the Order only to be met with a 10-hour or less runtime, I probably wouldn't have been as forgiving. I don't like the notion that games must meet a certain minimal runtime to be considered worth playing, lest the game become unnecessarily padded with uninteresting busywork and empty content just to meet some arbitrary sense that players must have X amount of game time to be worth the money they've spent. Games benefit from an even dose of quality and quantity. Given the choice between the two, I'll take quality every time. Lastly, we've got to talk about the ending and how that impacted my experience with the Order, because it did. If you've gotten this far and want to avoid that level of spoilers, then skip ahead to the time on screen now. The Order is short, but it's not the length of the game that I really have a problem with. It's simply that so many plot threads were left undone, so many elements unexplored, and especially the hidden supernatural elements waiting in the shadows never really got brought fully to light. Everything from the nature of Galahad's relationship with Izzy, what does the future hold for Ronnie and Levy, Lord Hastings being a vampire lord, and just how deep the half-breeds have infiltrated human society and taken up positions of power never get resolved. Hell, Hell, in the end, we never even get in a fight with a vampire. And what the hell is going down in America? The United India Company is shipping out vampires and half-breeds to America in droves at this point. Is the whole continent just one giant dinner buffet to them at this point? And why aren't they shipping them down to Australia? They hate those guys. You mean to tell me that they don't have a bunch of werewolves and vampires acting as wardens for the entire prison country? Will Tesla ever get credit for being a 1,000 times better inventor and human being than Thomas Edison? Is Galahad gonna come for the Order and take them out one by one like Kratos did to the entire Greek pantheon? And if Lancelot not only knew that Alistair was a half-breed, but also saved and rescued him as a werewolf pup and welcomed him into the Order, what other magnitude of things has he allowed to happen? Just how deeply corrupted is the Order at this point? I have so many questions, what the hell? I don't mind that the Order was short. Like I said, I prefer a succinct and focused game over one that unnecessarily drags itself out and wastes my time. But not having these answers just makes the game feel incomplete. I feel certain that Ready at Dawn left these plot threads dangling with an intention of baiting players into a sequel, and that can be a good strategy for maintaining interest, but it's one that backfires epically when no sequel gets made. This is the case with The Order, and it leaves me hugely conflicted as a result. I already feel some reservations about whether The Order is in fact good or not on account of its so-so gameplay and lack of depth. But much worse is the feeling of an experience, a story, an exploration of this world that is incomplete and will never reach any tangible resolution. Some people will say that's not the fault of the game. Lots of games go out on a cliffhanger and leave more questions than answers so they can continue to work through future games, and fair enough. It's also hard to separate this lack of resolution or a proper concluding narrative from the quality of the game itself. If the game had been able to garner a sequel, would I still feel this way? Would I see The Order as a self-contained game differently from The Order with a full continuation waiting in the wings? I can't really answer that. All I know is that the conflict I feel about whether The Order is good, great, or just kind of meh wasn't nearly so prominent a part of my experience until I realized it was over. I was left with more questions than answers, and I wouldn't be getting any of those answers resolved. And before anyone goes in on me in the comments about games don't have to answer your questions to be good, no shit. My favorite game series of all time is Dark Souls, and that game didn't answer shit about anything, except it did. The Order didn't have to answer all of my questions, but it did need to at least explore enough of its narrative and story to have an actual concrete conclusion. The Order ended up being a deeply conflicting game for me, and yet in defiance of all of its shortcomings and flaws. And even after the game wrapped and I was left grasping for everything I'll never get closure on, I still kind of loved it. The Order was a ballsy vision for a unique story that Ready at Dawn told in an unconventional way, bending all their creative vision and talent to a rich narrative told through bleeding-edge visuals that put all of gaming at the time to shame. The Order's focus on a cinematic approach, while certainly not to everybody's taste, is inarguably the top tier of any such style. The Order got a lot of flack and hate, and honestly, I think a good deal of that comes down to a lot of players not getting what they expected the game to be. While The Order may be a conflicted game in some senses, and certainly is not perfect, it does not deserve all of the hate that has been heaped upon it. I would go so far as to say that it's a gem of a game, if one that is somewhat buried in the rough. And while The Order is not going to be for everybody, I do think it is deserving of the type of status and honor accorded a Knight of the Realm.